Hey everybody, thanks for joining. Feel free to say hi in the chat. Let me know that you can hear my voice. I'm coming through okay. And also you can see the Azure portal on my screen share. I've got a markdown widget on the dashboard that says a gentle introduction to Azure policy. Looks like my audio input is working. Fingers crossed, learning curve is a learning curve. You know how that goes. Okay, well, looks like in my time it's top of the hour, so why don't we get started? I really appreciate you for taking the time to come here live, and if you're watching this on playback, just as good, thank you. My name's Tim Werner, and for about a half hour or so, we're going to take a look at Azure Policy. I'm assuming that you have no previous experience with Azure Policy, and my main goals for you in the next 30 minutes or so is for you to walk away with a deeper appreciation of how Azure Policy can help your Azure governance work, and also to look forward, because the trend in Azure, one of the many trends I should say, hi Suri, how are you, is that Azure Policy is very much a cross-platform service, and more, increasingly, you're seeing different resource providers begin to use Azure Policy. A really good example recently, as a matter of fact, is Virtual Network Manager. Are you familiar with that product? I think they're still in public preview. But a network manager is a way for you to group together your virtual networks, some or all, depending upon your use case. And this technology integrates with Azure Policy, because one of the ways you can build your network groups is by creating a dynamic membership rule. So you might say, all VNets that have a taxonomic tag of Project X, let's say, join this network group, you see. And Azure Policy is that underlying engine that makes that happen. Another technology that uses Azure Policy a lot is Defender for Cloud, formerly called Azure Security Center. Instead of just having this scattershot bucket of recommendations, you can tune the recommendations that you get from Defender in a better way, particularly if your business is under regulatory compliance restrictions. That we've got this, as you can see right on the toolbar in Defender for Cloud, manage compliance policies. All of these recommendations and controls that are surfaced in MDC use Azure Policy under the hood, and it's all the same, of the same thing. So, why do you care? Well, because it's so pervasive as a compliance tool. What is compliance and why should you care? I think the way I want to frame this before we dive into a live demo of using policy is to link to something that you may already have some experience with, and that would be role-based access control. So think about, in your business, you're supporting some developers, some engineers, whomever. I have a resource group here called Cosmos Lab RG. Do I have anything in it? I've got a Cosmos DB account, I've got a data factory, and so on. Well, we can go to Access Control IAM, and we can make role assignments to give users and groups and service principals create, read, update, and or delete permissions at any of these Azure management scopes. You have your management groups down into the subscription scope. Then from subscription, we go down to the resource group, and from the resource group, we have our individual resources. And our role assignments will cascade. Let's see, for example, if we do a search for built-in roles, there's a number of built-in roles that give permissions to Cosmos. Think of virtual machines. We've got a number of virtual machine built-in roles. For example, if we had somebody who should be given privileges to create and manage virtual machines, but not sign into them. You see that separation of duties between the control plane and data plane? We could grant somebody virtual machine contributor, and they would be able to do that work, but they wouldn't be able to manage the virtual network. They wouldn't be able to do too much with storage, but on the VM scope, they would be able to do their job. So in short, what I've got here is when we look at role-based access control, we're giving permissions to do some sort of collection of create, read, update, delete operations. Somebody is able to deploy a VM, let's say. Now, here's where policy fits in hand in glove, finger in glove, with role-based access control. Just RBAC is not going to allow you to put guardrails around those deployments. What's to prevent your colleagues, for example, from deploying these Godzilla-sized virtual machines that are going to cost your company way too much money? What's going to prevent a colleague, not you, a colleague, from deploying, again, VM sizes would be one, locations would be another. You may have restrictions on what regions you can deploy to. These sorts of guardrails, this is Azure Policy's sweet spot, that you can shape those RBAC permissions so that when your users are doing their work, they're staying within your security, compliance, your governance requirements. Now, I've mentioned that more and more I'm seeing in Azure different products or resource providers, as they're called, spring up that are taking advantage of policy. Another one that's very to the moment is called Azure Automation Machine Configuration. It's previously called Guest Config. Are you familiar with that? This started its life mostly in Azure Automation. I don't know if I have an Azure Automation account yet. If I can type. In Azure Automation, you have the ability to set up a cloud-based PowerShell desired state configuration server. And this is basically virtual machine configuration management. Well, nowadays, long story short, we probably should do a separate live stream on guest config / Azure Automation Machine Config, because it's a big, important subject. But that is using Azure Policy as well under the hood. So again, it's one of those things that I say. In fact, I mentioned this to some colleagues yesterday, that in the earlier days of PowerShell, there was still is to a degree, a push where IT professionals realize, excuse me, if I'm going to have any longevity in my IT career, I better stop putting off learning PowerShell. I want to make the same evangelization with Azure Policy, that if you want to have longevity in the Azure cloud, regardless of whether you're a developer, architect, administrator, whatever you are, there's stuff to be learned and good controls to be leveraged in Azure Policy that can probably help you and help you add value to your business, help your business add value to your customers. So with all that preliminary, how does Azure Policy actually work under the hood? Well, like I said, I'm setting our expectations here that this is beginner level, gentle introduction. So let me give you that bird's eye perspective. Here's the Azure Policy dashboard in the portal. You probably know that you can interact with Azure Resource Manager in a number of different ways. The portal is normally what people start with, but we can also interact with Azure Policy using all of the other abstractions, whether it's Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI, all of that. In fact, you'll notice, although I haven't showed you yet, that all of your policy artifacts are JSON documents, as we would expect, I guess, globally with any REST API. But specific to Azure, it uses JSON as its data payload. So what I want you to understand is you need to think about what controls and governance do you want to apply to your Azure environment. And then, is there a built-in policy definition that already covers that use case? Now, I don't want to get too far off into the weeds, but you know how I just said, what is it in Azure that you want to control? I want you to understand also, you are not in any way limited to Azure with Azure Policy. You can apply your Azure Policy governance outside of Azure. You can have it come down to your on-prem data centers. You could have it go cross-cloud to AWS or Google Cloud, for instance. What would the requirement be? You would really, I would recommend that you consider onboarding those off-cloud machines using Azure Arc. Specifically, it's called Azure Arc, or Azure Arc Enabled Servers, I think is the formal product name. You simply install an agent on those Windows Server and Linux machines off cloud, communicates over the internet, TCP 443, and you can then apply policy, including remediation, to those off-cloud machines. So just keep that in the back of your brain. We're not limiting this just to Azure. Really powerful. So here we are in the definitions list, and you see here we've got some controls that may be unfamiliar at first. we've got scope. Scope plays a major part in Azure policy. It's important for us to understand how those scopes work. Let me repeat. I mentioned it a few minutes ago. I want to mention it again now. At the very top of the Azure management hierarchy, excuse me, I'm dehydrated today, evidently. You have the tenant root scope, and that tenant refers to the Azure AD tenant. And you can't get any higher in the management hierarchy than the tenant root scope. Beneath that, you optionally can bring in management groups, which are a container that allow you to put one or more subscriptions into, and then you can apply policy to the management group and have it cascade by inheritance through all of your subscriptions. You may want to scope at the subscription level, which would flow down to resource groups. You may be really particular and want to scope to the resource group. You see that? So scope comes into play here as an assumed skill. So this is saying, just from a view perspective, at what level do you want to look? Because the idea is that when you create your own Azure policies, you choose where you want them available. So scope really is an unavoidable thing you have to know about. Another thing you have to know about is initiative versus policy. Policies are individual JSON docs that do one thing generally. You might want to report on, do your virtual machines, are they configured to report to log analytics? Do they have an anti-malware client installed? Are they having updates managed with Azure? You know, all of this sort of stuff. But you'll probably find in the real world that you have need for multiple related policies. And the idea is, wouldn't it be nice, instead of I've got these 12 policies, I'm going to do 12 assignments and track them all individually? Are you serious? No, you don't have to. The initiative is a container that you can assign once and track as a container object. You've just populated the policies that you want inside of it. So keep that in your head. Now, one thing that I've seen cause a wee bit of confusion in industry is some of the nomenclature or some of the vocabulary here. Specifically, initiative is that term for that container object that holds one or more policy definitions. And that's what you see in the UI. But the underlying API uses a different term, policy set. So if you see policy set in the Microsoft docs, just map that in your brain. That means initiative. It's the same exact thing. Now, this is a library of all of the built-ins that Microsoft provides, as well as any custom policies that you create yourself. You see, and you can filter on all of that in the view. That's all fine. All of these are out at GitHub anyway. If you go out to GitHub/Azure/Azure-policy, every week, the definitions, the built-in definitions behind the scenes at Microsoft are pushed out here into the public. So it's a weekly cadence. I think it happens on Thursday or Friday. But what we can do is come in here and go into built-in policies and notice that there's policy definitions and policy set definitions. So as it turns out, everything is JSON. So your initiatives are a JSON document under the hood. Your individual policies are JSON under the hood. Morn, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm seeing that you can't hear. Is anybody else having hearing difficulty? I'm hoping not. I do see that my audio meter is working on my side. Haven't seen anything else, Morn. My fingers are crossed for you. Check your audio outputs on your system. Thank you, Manish. I appreciate you. Yeah, so these are the canonical definitions, and they come in, almost every variety. For every Azure product, you'll also find regulatory compliance ones here for different compliance certifications. That's a really big use case, actually, of these Azure policy definitions and initiative definitions. Let's just jump right in, shall we? Let me draw up a quick use case. Let's say that we want to control allowed locations. We want to make sure that our colleagues, that our team members are deploying new resources only to authorized regions. Number two, let's say that we can deploy only certain VM sizes. Those are kind of contrived, because if you look in the list here, this gets really, really broad and deep. Check this out, just parenthetically. A common use case for businesses is that they use taxonomic tags in order to logically group resources across resource groups for cost reporting purposes. Well, as it happens, one of the categories for the built-ins is specifically on tags. So some of these are awfully useful in terms of making sure that if one of your colleagues does a deployment and they forget to tag those resources, policy can actually do that for you. Besides just reporting on compliance, there's a robust remediation engine that's built into policy. You might also be thinking, well, this is going to be great for future deployments. That's great. But what about all of the deployments that we've made over the last year and a half? What can policy do to help us there? Well, guess what? It can do the same two things. It can look at your existing infrastructure and report on its compliance state, and depending upon what the effect is in the policy definition, you can run remediation and have Azure Policy bring those resources back into compliant state. Powerful, powerful. We're going to jump right in and create a sample initiative. Remember, this is our policy set. It's a container that can hold one or more existing policies. Where do I want to scope this initiative? If I set this at my subscription scope, then it will only be available at the subscription, resource group, and resource level within this sub. If I choose tenant root, then this initiative would be available across all my subscriptions, no matter how many I had. I'm going to put it at the subscription level, and I'm going to call this Livestream Initiative. How's that for a creative? Thank you, Tim. Happy to see you here. Left side audio, no stereo. Okay, I appreciate that. Okay, I'll see what I can do in between this session and next week to do mono instead of what it's doing. Left side, okay. All right, anyway, so there's the name. Description is optional. Category, we can use an existing one or we can create a new. I don't remember if I created a category for this. Why don't we create a new category called Livestream? And we can version these. Another question that you might be thinking in your head is, do you have to use the portal when you're working with your initiatives and policy definitions? No, you don't have to. They're all JSON, so I would hope that your custom definitions are all in source control anyway. If I have time, I'll show you. You can export and import to and from your subscription. Unfortunately, at this time, the export functionality is limited to GitHub, which is awesome if your team uses GitHub. If not, it may present a little bit of an annoyance. All right, so we've got our metadata. The initiative, the main part, is going to be what policy defs are you going to include. So let's click Add Policy Definitions. And I just happen to know, because I've used it so often, that there is a built-in policy definition called Allowed Locations. Looks like there's a few different ones for resource groups, for Cosmos, or just in general. I'm going to choose this general one. I also want to bring in another one because that's the idea with initiatives. You may have multiple related individual policy definitions. Let's see, how about allowed skew? I'm just doing some keywords. Storage accounts should be limited by allowed skews. Well, we could try that instead of virtual machines. Let's do that, a little bit simpler. But the idea here is that you've done some due diligence and you've browsed through those built-ins and you optionally might have tweaked a built-in. I'm happy to show you how to do that to create your own custom policy. I would also encourage you, besides going out to Microsoft's own Azure Policy Store at GitHub, do a search for community contributions, because maybe somebody has designed custom initiative definitions that are just right for what you need. Why reinvent the proverbial wheel, you know? What else do we have here? Let's go next. Groups. Now, groups is useful if you've got a whole lot of policies. What if you have like 50 or 60 policies in this initiative? As it's going to grow, it's going to get increasingly difficult to manage, isn't it? So you can create these logical groups that can just bundle or partition, for lack of a better term, those many policy definitions. So that's just for easier management. It's not required by any stretch. Something else that's not required but could be handy is to define initiative level parameters. Again, this is going to be most useful when you've got a lot of policy in an initiative. You might have a bunch of policy files that all have the same initiative. You see what I mean? When you assign the initiative, you're going to need to plug in any policy parameters that are outstanding unless you've done a default value inside the definition itself. Are you really going to want to redo that same value n number of times? You don't have to. You can surface one or more parameters. You can define them at the initiative level, and then when you assign the initiative, it will inject what you provide there at the initiative level into all the policies that have a matching initiative in their definition. So it's just something in terms of automation and having an easier workflow for you and your team to think about. Now, it looks like here's where we have the opportunity to specify what our values are going to be here. So for allowed locations, I'll show you the definition of a policy afterwards. I just wanted to get us marching along practically as quickly as possible. You can either have the policy inherit from the initiative if you defined a parameter there, or you can set a value. Both of these are using the array data type, which means that we can supply more than one value. That makes sense because for allowed locations, you may very well have more than one of those. I'm going to say East US and East US 2 are my allowed ones. And for storage accounts are limited by allowed SKUs, let's see what's in that enumeration. Let's just say that our developers or whomever can only use, let's say, standard LRS, the cheapest type of storage. So what could you expect to happen then if we put this initiative out there as an assignment and somebody tries to deploy to, say, North Europe? Or what if somebody tries to deploy a premium ZRS or GRS storage account? What do we want the policy to do? See, that's something else you need to think about and plan about because as it happens, there are a number of policy effects to choose from. One step at a time, though. Think that's it. So we are creating a new initiative that consists of two built-in policies. They could just as well have been custom. It doesn't matter that they're built-in. This view is showing you the definition of the initiative, and I can see right here that the effect type is deny. I think what would be useful would be for us to dive in and look closer at the JSON just so we understand it. So let's grab this allowed locations policy, and I'm going to just do a Control A and a Control C, and I'll throw that JSON into VS Code, and let's take a look here. Now, you have an advantage if you have previous experience with Azure Resource Manager template JSON, because Azure Policy JSON is very similar, almost identical, really. And what we've got here, I want to call out, you've got your description metadata, you've got your name, that's fine, built-in or custom for policy type. The main things I want you to see are parameters, which is going to make your policy more flexible. In this case, this allowed locations policy has one parameter called list of allowed locations. And this is going to be the descriptions metadata. I would strongly suggest you fill out because you're really going to help your teammates with a nice, clear description here. List of allowed locations. Now, the data type here is a little bit whack, to use my technical language. Strong type is a reserved word, and strong type location is what allows Azure to auto-create that list of locations. You saw a moment ago how I could open a drop-down. It's a dynamic field. Now, we could just do an allowed values array and just hand code that array if we wanted to. Up to you. Strong type is just what's in this built-in definition. So parameters are fine because they allow us to make the policy more modular. The actual evaluation, when Azure Policy does a compliance scan, it's going to look at its policy rule, which consists of a simple or complex if statement. This one is saying if all of these evaluate to true, then we've got an effect. What are the three things? The main one is this first one. If the field in the deployment record is, if the location field in the deployment record is not in your list of allowed locations, that's coming in through your parameters. So you might recognize line 26 if you've done work with ARM deployment templates, because you can use the ARM template functions in your Azure policy definitions. So the parameters function simply resolves the value of the given parameter name. In this case, we already saw there's a single parameter called list of allowed locations. So that makes sense. Now there's some additional ones here. It says that not only not in the list of allowed locations, but it also has to be a regional resource. In other words, it can't be a resource like Traffic Manager, for example, that's global rather than regional. And it also can't be an Azure AD Business to Consumer directory. I always find that kind of funny. But the effect here is deny. So in other words, this policy will protect deployments. That if somebody tries to deploy to a region that's not in your list of allowed, ARM is going to reject the request. It's as simple as that. Those are the main points here of a policy definition. There's a great docs article, Azure Policy Effects Docs, that runs them all out for you here. And so these are the different effects you can have the policy do if the compliance turns out to be you're out of compliance. You know, there's some low touch ones. Disabled would be a way to temporarily or permanently switch off a policy to where you still might have it assigned, but it's not going to do any evaluation. You can have it just audit the existence or non-existence, the compliance state of resources. The ones that are the heavy hitters, in my opinion, denies pretty heavy because it's going to block a deployment. But modify, that's used a lot with the taxonomic tag ones, where you'd give policy permissions to add a tag to a resource where it should be if it hasn't been added previously. Deploy if not exists is very powerful. That's called DINE for short. This is where you've got ARM deployment code at the ready. And if during a compliance scan, maybe you have as one of your policies that such and so VM needs to be there, and one of your colleagues deletes it because they thought that it was just left over from a pilot project or something. Well, when that resource fails compliance, if you've got DINE, policy will run that ARM template to recreate the resource. So there's a lot of heavy configuration management at play here, and this again I think is a reason why the Azure Automation people and some of the PowerShell DSC people realized that they could put machine configuration into and use Azure Policy as its engine, because it is hybrid cloud, multi-cloud aware, it's robust, it's cloud scale, you know, fill in the blanks. There is a new policy effect that's in public preview now called manual, and that's more or less an edgier case. The manual policy effect is used for businesses who need to track compliance for a resource or for something. It literally can be anything that's not defined in the ARM schema. So you can literally create your own attestation and track it in Azure Policy and report on it in your compliance documentation, but it's all manually assessed. So, I mean, it could be something as corny as your policy is that you have to have at least 24 Nespresso pods at your office. You know, it's literally for anything that you can attest to manually, but track using the Azure Policy tools. Anyway, enough about that. Let's come back here, and let's come back to our initiative here, our Livestream initiative. And we might as well just assign it. So let's do an assignment next. And you can do these assignments, as I've said at the beginning of this live stream, a number of different ways. You know, I'm going through the portal, but you don't have to. You can do all this as part of a build release process. You can do it programmatically via, actually, you could just use curl or Postman. You could use raw ARM API requests, you know. So I'm going to assign this at, do I want to put it at the subscription scope? That's a little bit broad. So I'm going to sharpen this, and I'm going to bring it down to that Cosmos Lab RG resource group. Scratch that. I'm going to put it on my MS Press RG resource group. And this may be in the real world something you would do to test, to make sure that you iron out any false positive results. And of course, worst case scenario, you don't want to create an unintentional denial of service or mess something up in your production environment. Now in Azure Policy, there's at least a couple ways to make exceptions and exclusions. One would be exclusions here, where based on your scope, you can go to the next level down and you can exclude. If you make an assignment at the subscription level, you can exclude resource groups from evaluation. I'm applying this one at the resource group level, so I can go within that resource group and say, don't evaluate my TW Cosmos 1 account. You see what I mean? So that's one way. Honestly, between you, me, and the wall, I would encourage you, rather than look at doing your exceptions here within the assignment, at a higher level within Azure policy itself, there's the concept of the exemption. You might want to consider making a canonical exemption there that then would apply for any assignment you make. So it just depends on what your scope of work is. So I'm going to leave the assignment name alone. I'm going to enforce this. Here's my user account that's doing the assignment for auditing purposes. I don't have any parameters that I need because I've supplied them in the definition of the initiative already. Remediation, this has two important factors. One would be, what is the permissions required to do a remediation? The only time you're going to need remediation is when you're doing work with the deploy if not exists and modify effects. Hopefully it makes sense that you're going to need authorization to do something like a write operation in Azure. So the normal pattern here is to allow policy to create and use a system-assigned managed identity in your Azure AD tenant. Actually, you could use your own user-assigned managed identity if you want to. The deal here is that you can specify the permissions that it gives. The default is going to, if memory serves, is that Azure will do contributor at the subscription scope. But who's going to like that? That's pretty broad, isn't it? I think it's in the definition of the policy where you can override and you can cut down the level of permissions that you want that managed identity to have. Unfortunately, I didn't choose a policy that would require a managed identity, so I don't see the UI the way that I normally do. But I think here you only get a read-only view of those permissions. It would be in the original definition JSONs where you can add a block to scope down the managed identity permissions, and keeping in mind least privilege. You don't want the managed identity to have too much privilege. All right, so non-compliance is the other thing. What do you want to surface in your UI or in your console log to the calling user or process when they fail compliance, you see? So for an allowed locations, do you want to show custom text in the Azure portal, for example, or do you just want to let ARM and Azure policy show default text? So this could be useful. You could just give your folks more information, frankly, because some of Azure's error output, let's face it, is a little inscrutable. So anyway, you can just select per policy if you want to deliver a non-compliance message. So for allowed locations, I'm going to say, you must choose East US or East US 2, something like that. So let's go next, review and create. And there it is. It says here in the feedback here, please note that the assignment takes around 30 minutes. We should find that it takes effect before 30 minutes. I think that's a little bit of legalese going on there. But if we come back to the policy console, we can track the assignment in a few different spots. We can come down to assignments, making sure that our scope is set correctly. We can also customize show me only initiatives, for example. Here's our live stream initiative. Okay, and we can go back into it where we can edit the assignment. We can view the underlying JSON. We can jump right to the compliance blade. We can change the scope at which this initiative is assigned. We can do an nice controls here right along the top. Let me go to view compliance. And this brings us to the compliance dashboard where we can see it looks like that the compliance evaluation hasn't kicked in quite yet. Of course, you want to see 100% for your resource compliance. These views just give you at a glance how you're doing in terms of that compliance. And we can filter down below. We can look at the individual policies within this initiative. We can get a quick report on non-compliant resources and then any events that, that occur in that. Let's step back here to our policy blade here. Let's see, as far as remediation tasks, like I say, these really only come into play when you're dealing with the deploy if not exists or modify effects. And this covers the use case where you've got existing resources and you want policy to evaluate those compliance states and then take that modify or deploy if not exists action to bring those resources into compliance. Potentially very powerful. More so, you can configure remediation tasks to run yourself as well. So this is allowing us to track all that stuff as well. Now, let me see if I can remember what the events is all about. I think the idea here is you can tie Azure policy into something like Event Grid. Yes, that's what it is. Okay, so what's this all about? You may have certain resources that you're tracking compliance for that it's not enough for you and your colleagues to just, on whatever cadence you do, come in here and just look. Okay, let's see, we have anything out of compliance today? No, okay, we're good. No, you might have some serious repercussions of a resource falling out of compliance. And so the event subscription business is potentially useful because you can say, for example, that if your resource falls out of compliance, you want to take action now. So this brings up the power of event-driven architectures in Azure. An event grid is, if you haven't used it before, it's a fully managed platform service that enables you to subscribe to any of these events across all of the Microsoft Cloud platform pretty much, and then take that event and then send it somewhere else. You might send it to an Azure function or to an Azure automation runbook. You might want to trigger a remediation task to do something, in other words, reactive response. So that's what you've got here. So we can create an event grid system topic that's going to dial in and look at the state of a particular resource. And traditionally, you would want to key on if the resource state goes to non-compliant. Then you've got yourself a message in the event grid. You might have an Azure function that uses an event grid as its trigger. You see what I mean? So there we have, reminds me, that notion of event-driven architectures, it reminds me of dominoes, really, in a way, where you've got dominoes stacked, and once you apply that trigger, that first force, they just fall down. Although we can be more intentional in Azure, can't we? All right, anything else here? Well, let's test this out. Let's see if it's actually available for use yet. So for grins, let's go over to storage accounts. And we're going to try to fail compliance on 2 accounts here. I'm going to, first of all, I'll put it in my, I have to remember where we assigned the initiative. We assigned it to my MS Press resource group, so I want to make sure to deploy there. I'll give the storage account a globally unique name. Now, number 1, I'm going to go somewhere else. West Europe instead of East. Okay. Not seeing anything yet. Number 2, I'm going to make sure to choose a different SKU or stock keeping unit. Let's see. Pubs, file shares. Well, okay, that's interesting. Why am I seeing that? Hang on a second. Let me set the performance to standard and see if I can choose a higher SKU for redundancy. It must be that my compliance stuff hasn't really kicked in yet. It says here that the initiative assignment succeeded, but it looks like I've got some latency. What I'm expecting to see in full candor is that we should see some remediation text almost immediately when we choose a region that's not allowed. Let me jump into another browser tab. I notice we've already gone over a half hour. Kurt, oh boy, that's a great question. If you don't know, everybody, Kurt asked in the chat about the compliance. There is a doc that goes into the compliance, the scan interval. Let me see if I can find it. Compliance interval docs. Occurs once every 24 hours. Well, that seems way too broad. No, there's some algebra going on here. A resource, okay, the following are the times that cause a resource to be evaluated. A resource is created or updated in a scope. Okay, so during create or update, at assignment of the policy or initiative, whenever you update a policy or initiative, And then other than that, it's every 24 hours. Interesting. That seems pretty broad. I'll have to ask my colleagues about that. I mean, 24 hours seems like a long time. And that information is in the What is Azure Policy doc. All right, well, anyway, I was expecting to see some red text immediately. The way policy used to work historically is that it would let you get all the way to deploying and then it would bomb. I've noticed now it's much more responsive. And what I was expecting to see by choosing an out-of-compliance region is some red text basically saying you're not going to validate unless and until you're in an authorized or allowed region. You see what I mean? Likewise, the behavior of choosing a SKU that's not allowed as well. So long story short, we should not expect this to go through. For grins, let me see if I can get all the way through and submit it. Okay, well, it is saying validation failed here at any point, and if we click to view the details, okay, so it is being disallowed by policy. Again, these are questions that I can surface back to the team. Why I'm not reliably seeing that feedback right at the beginning, which is what I ideally think should happen. Okay. All right, Arino, let's come back one more time to policy. Any other questions you have here? Tim, thanks for that clip. I appreciate that. I'll definitely correct the audio issue before next week. Anything else you want to know about? Now, if you're a certification candidate, you might wonder about this. Policy is all over those Azure exams for sure. I mean, specifically, Microsoft Learn's done a lot of work to try to reduce the overlap that exists among a lot of the exams. Well, that used to exist among a lot of the exams. But the main ones that you're going to see heavy coverage on policy would be the Azure Administrator, the Azure Architect, Solutions Architect. You might see some on the Azure DevOps or the Microsoft DevOps exam to a smaller degree, just in terms of in Azure DevOps, you might know that you can use Azure Policy as a gate in your release process, such that the release process will stop if any of the resources that are in your scope of deployment fail the policy evaluation. 104, 305, 400, those are the main ones. But just like I said at the beginning of this session, how Azure Policy is creeping across Azure big time more and more, it also, because it's cross-service, tends to show up quite a bit across the various certification exams. So that would be another feather in your cap, it seems to me, in terms of a skill to add value in your career. Let's see here. You know something? I wanted to mention this just as an aside. It is related. Are you familiar with OpenAI at all? One of my colleagues at Microsoft turned me on to this. My daughter and I actually use another OpenAI product called DALL-E, D-A-L-L-E. This is where you can send in free text. Show me a picture of Satya Nadella in a clown costume riding a unicycle off a mountain or something, and it'll use AI to generate art. It's really cool. Well, if you go to beta.openai.com/playground, you have to sign in with a credential. I use my personal Google account. This will generate code for you using your free text input. So as an example, I really needed to do this recently. Write a PowerShell script to generate a GUID, a globally unique identifier, and pull the last 5 characters into a variable. It will do it for you. And it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Now, it says here that the default model's training data cuts off in 2021, but my colleague Tom told me that you can actually train this. Now, you wouldn't want to send proprietary code here. You'd only want to ask questions, and then submit code in your training that's sanitized. But this is potentially very useful. I'm not exactly sure the extent to it yet, but let me show you. It actually is aware of Azure Policy. Write Azure Policy to control deployment regions. You know, like that allowed policy. Sometimes you get better responses than others. How about write Azure Policy JSON to control Cosmos DB replicas? So if nothing else, this AI might give you a flying head start if you're developing a custom policy. That's something I want to finish with here, actually. If we go back to policy definitions, you might want to do something different from, slightly different or dramatically different from a built-in. So the pattern for that, let me just grab this one here at random. The pattern is you can grab the closest built-in that fits your use case, and you can duplicate it. Now, you can't edit a built-in. Those are read-only. So I would duplicate this. I can change the name as much as I want. I'll just say Livestream dash. Put it into a new category, existing, whatever. You can import a definition from GitHub as well. Click Save. And once you've got a copy, now you have read-write access to that resource, and you can customize the JSON to your heart's content. So I wanted to show that. As far as the export flow goes, you can do that right from the portal. Look up here on the definitions blade. So you can export your definitions and assignments, and that way they're in source code control, so you can control and collaborate them on there. But like I said, at this point, the integration is only with GitHub, and it's in public preview, so fingers crossed that there may be support for, well, we would expect Azure repos, I suppose. But in terms of Bitbucket or other cloud-based Git repositories, I don't know, to be honest with you. All right, H. Lopez, any ETA on the rest of the AZ700 videos at Pluralsight? Well, I actually did that whole learning path. I'm not sure. It could be just a case where the Pluralsight search engine is not helping you. Honestly, between you and me, speaking very candidly, I find my Pluralsight courses, not the ones I teach, but when I'm studying, I don't use the Pluralsight search engine because, frankly, it's pretty broken. I use Google. So I would do something like AZ700 course site:/pluralsight.com and go that way. I can tell you two things. One, I completed the whole AZ700 track for Pluralsight. And for those who don't know, AZ700 is one of the Azure certifications. It's on Network Engineer. That's the skill path. So it's all about software-defined networking through an administrator's lens. So it is there, it is complete. But number two, this is important. I'm not happy about it, but Pluralsight is basically nuking all of my Azure courses out of their library at the end of this year. Now, they're not going to be totally disappeared. Evidently, if you create what are called, in Pluralsight, if you sign up, you can create your own channels, I think they're called. Definitely put those courses in the channel where they'll stay after December 31st, but it'll be pretty hard to find them after this year. Why they're doing that? I think it's because they want to use the A Cloud Guru Azure courses. Pluralsight bought A Cloud Guru a year or two ago, and they don't want to have all these competing head-to-head courses. Whatevs, whatevs. Other questions? Okay. Well, I'm glad that the Streamlabs software that I'm using here stood up. The last week it kind of bombed out and I had to generate a new URL. I'm glad this one stayed throughout. Thanks so much for joining me. And, you know, let me know in the YouTube, because this goes immediately to my YouTube channel. Let me know in the comments there about any future topics you want to see. I'm just choosing these ones off the top of my head based on stuff that I do in my day job. But, you know, I'm here for you. So please send me your detailed feedback on what you want to see in the future, okay? All right.